the quality that I had, which I feel is most important in the function, is the ability to build rapport really quickly and to earn trust really quickly, because everybody's going to have their guard up no matter what you're selling. So if you can overcome that in a shorter amount of time, that's going to ultimately set you up to win the sale. So some of those things came more naturally to me. Like in growing up, I was always like being very friendly and just always kind of building rapport with all types of groups of different people. I was in band, I played on the football team, so I learned how to interact with different types of people too. But the trust factor is just the biggest piece that people need to learn. And that's what a buyer looks for, is if they're going to sign, they want to know that they can trust you. And that has to happen earlier in that relationship.
Welcome back to the Career Therapy Podcast, where we help you navigate the emotional and promotional sides of the job search so you can change careers with confidence. My name is Martin McGovern, founder and lead coach of Career Therapy, and I'm excited to introduce our guest today. Please welcome Eddie Patzsch to the podcast. Eddie is the CEO and co-founder at partnerportal.io. He built his sales career with companies including AdRoll, Groupon, and Searchmetrics, and he's also responsible for some of my favorite guilty pleasure television shows that I used to watch in my youth, including recruiting folks to be on the MTV show Parental Control, which was one of my favorite cringe-worthy dating shows back in the day. Today, we talk about how old school sales tactics are changing as new technologies, pandemic forces, and generational changes reshape our world. Eddie shares his thoughts on how non-salespeople can leverage different approaches to build their confidence in their job search. And we discuss the nuances of showcasing value and the idea of faking it till you make it in both sales and in your career. Thank you for tuning in and supporting our show. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes and share this with someone that you know who is struggling in their job search. We're on a mission to help people build confidence in their careers, and we really hope that this show can help. So put your feet up, relax, and listen in to our conversation with Eddie Patzsch. Today's episode is brought to you by HIRECT.us, a free app that lets hiring teams and candidates instantly chat about incredible job opportunities. If you're a hiring manager, CEO, or recruiter, download the HIRECT app to see a curated list of talented individuals and accelerate your hiring process 10 times faster than traditional ways. And if you're a job seeker, join the platform to start talking to decision makers at startups who are ready to hire. Businesses grow faster when everyone is communicating seamlessly. Download HIRECT.us, that's HIRECT.us today.
It's good to be back. Second time around.
Hell yeah. I'm really excited to chat because you've got a lot of really cool stuff going on with Portal, your company, and there's just so much happening in the world right now, technologically, pandemic wise, and, sales is such a critical part of the job search, as well as there's so many people trying to get careers in sales right now. And so I think there's just a lot that we can talk about in regards to communication, in regards to technology, in regards to how things are shifting, and maybe even generational shifts of what's going on in this marketplace. And I want to sort of kick things off before we start looking at like what has changed about sales and what people can learn about these new forms of communication that are popping up all over the place. I want to take a look back. What was getting into sales like for you when you first entered the field, and what was the environment like?
Yeah. So nobody really sets out to be in sales. Very few people say, hey, I want to go in sales. Usually the ones that go into it they had some exposure or some understanding from a friend or somebody that's already in it. And even that first person probably kind of stumbled into it. It's changing a little bit now, where people can go to school for sales related courses and degrees. But when I first came in, it just wasn't really a thing. Also, there was always kind of a negative connotation with sales, which admittedly still probably exists in a lot of ways in a lot of industries. So it's kind of the last thing that I was thinking about doing. I went into my school. I went to Chapman out in California, and I did a PR advertising major. with a psychology minor. I was going to go into advertising and use my psychology abilities to come up with really mind-bending ads. But what it turned out was that industry was just, it was kind of a hard industry to break into initially as a college grad. Instead, I got picked up into MTV. So I actually started working at MTV as my first job, and I was doing casting. And so I was casting people onto some shows I think I've told you about, like True Life, but even better, Parental Control. And so I was convincing people to go put their lives on national television for MTV. And a buddy of mine just kind of pointed out one day, he's like, look, you're already in sales. You're already selling people to go put their life on national exposure. Why don't you consider a sales role? So that was the first time I started to really think about it as a profession. And then, yeah, my early days in sales were very much the boiler room type environments, like very much so. My first job here when I moved to Chicago was a glamorous office in the NBC Tower until you walked in and realized what you were doing. And we were just working off a stack of leads that were printed and just cold calling CEOs from billion-dollar companies and trying to convince them to come to this event that we were putting on. If you were good on the phone, you would earn computer time. So if you earned your computer time, that's when you would get to go print your own leads. So that was my early days in sales, and of course, it's a changed and evolved a lot since then.
Yeah, I wonder if those rooms still exist even. It just sounds, it sounds so very like 2000s, you know? But that
sounds like 80, but this was in 2009, 2010. I mean, it wasn't too long ago.
Yeah, and it is funny because I think back to those times and I'm like, I remember when I was in my first job, just trying to work remote, like we had desktop computers when I first started. We didn't even have laptops. And so the idea of working remote, I had to like log in from this like crummy IBM computer I had at home, and it took like 2.5 hours to just log into this like multi-layered system. But yeah, it is crazy how things have changed. And you know, that sort of boiler room type environment, I think there's a lot of stereotypes around the world of sales, maybe some justified, maybe some not. And I'm kind of curious, like when it comes to those stereotypes, how do you look at them? Do you view them as like, actually, yeah, that's kind of how it is, or people have maybe a skewed perspective on it, or maybe it's just contextual? What stereotypes do you feel are warranted, and which ones do you feel are maybe a little overblown?
Yeah, I mean, the stereotype that's warranted is that it's an absolute grind to have one of those jobs, and it's stressful. You're constantly getting hung up on. You're dealing with like the true behaviors that people talk about in a sales world. But one of the things that's interesting about it is that when I'm hiring, I will dig in and ask people the same question, even if they're 15, 20 years into their career. I do want to know how they started their sales career. And a lot of times, if they give me an answer that's around something similar, like that type of environment, maybe they went door to door and sold knives at Cutco or something, but that start to sales is such a great foundation to have, even for the largest enterprise brands that are people that are in sales, because it shows to me that they went through that, and they went through the grind of having to pick up the phone and make 150 dials a day. They know what it takes to have that type of work ethic. And not that I would expect them to do it for me now, but at least I know that they had those humble beginnings, and they did put in the dues that were required to be good and pick up on the things that would make them a better seller today.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting because a lot of times people are pretty negative about marketing and sales. And I'll even admit, you know, when I was in advertising, I got a little jaded here and there, right? But these are incredibly necessary pieces of any business, right? Like a business can't function without it. And honestly, our careers can't function without a little bit of salesmanship. So even people that aren't in sales really do need to learn the basics of sales. And kind of what you're talking about, that cold calling. I remember one of my first internships in college. I was working at a movie PR company, and our entire job was to get people to free early viewings of movies, like just give out free movie tickets to people. And the difficulty we had getting people to just take free movie tickets blew my mind. Like, it's like, we're just calling and giving you free tickets to the movies. And people were like, what's the catch? What are you trying to get from me? We're like, we just need butts and seats to see how you react to this awful Sydney White movie with Amanda Bynes. And so it's really funny to sort of, look at a bit of the ridiculousness of it, but also understanding like how necessary it is. And, before you actually realized you were a salesperson and before you were at MTV, like, did you have that natural tendency to like be a little bit more salesy, or is that something that you sort of had to develop within yourself?
No, I was not by any means. Like, I may have been kind of like undercover persuasive, but never a true sales persuasive. That wasn't a quality that I had. The quality that I had, which I feel is most important in the function, is the ability to build rapport really quickly and to earn trust really quickly, because everybody's going to have their guard up no matter what you're selling. So if you can overcome that in a shorter amount of time, that's going to ultimately set you up to win the sale. So some of those things came more naturally to me. Like in growing up, I was always like being very friendly and just always kind of building rapport with all types of groups of different people. I was in band, I played on the football team, so I learned how to interact with different types of people too. But the trust factor is just the biggest piece that people need to learn. And that's what a buyer looks for, is if they're going to sign, they want to know that they can trust you. And that has to happen earlier in that relationship.
I love that you just said rapport and trust, because those are literally the two words that I tell people whenever they're going into interviews. I'm always like, the main things you have to do in this interview is build rapport and build trust. It's kind of crazy that you pulled those same two words out. And I think most people are focused on all the wrong things when they are trying to sell themselves or build their career or something like that. They're focused on like being right. They're focused on sounding intelligent. They're focused on looking good rather than actually connecting. And this like prevents people from asking good questions, or prevents people from being curious, or even just getting out of their own head and thinking about the problem they're trying to solve for the other person, right? And so I think that's one of the biggest shifts and one of the biggest positives of being in sales, or of doing sales at some point in your life, is that there are metrics that salespeople have to hit, right? So it is about you. But if you only think about hitting your metrics, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot, right? And so like, how do you sort of maybe help people learn how to put the customer first in some ways?
Yeah. I mean, the metrics that a lot of early sellers hone in on or prioritize are the end metrics of a closed deal and the revenue that's generated and how many closed won deals I had for the quarter or whatever it might be. But there's so many interesting activities and engagements and events that occur prior to a closed won deal. And all of that can be measured with a really well thought out process. So things that, for example, if you have a focus in a job interview on building rapport and trust, the end goal becomes getting the job, but there's 10 steps that have to happen before you get the job, and rapport and trust would be the first and second. And so if you start to measure the more of the intangibles in some way, where I can check off and say, hey, I feel that I did develop a rapport in that first interview. And the questions that they're asking me now, I do feel like I've earned the trust of this hiring manager. If I start to measure myself on those, and I have a really specific formula that I'm following there, it becomes a little easier to remove those the non-tangibles and focus less on the end and more on the process.
Yeah. If you could break down the process, what do you think maybe the phases are of building trust, getting into someone's good graces, and then getting a sale? What would that sort of arc look like? Is it different every time, or are there kind of, typical patterns that emerge?
It's definitely different every time. The trust and rapport for sure. If I feel like I get to a point where we're having kind kind of impromptu dialogue or impromptu interaction, if I can get them onto a texting level, like a buddy, that's when I know I've earned the trust and rapport, and that means I could actually start to push a little bit more in terms of urgency. That means I could push a little more in terms of like what I feel like they should be buying, and then kind of go from there. But the underlying piece that's happening along the way is the value. So have I shown them the value that this is going to help them? Have they had their light bulb moment? And did I recognize when that moment happened? And so that's kind of part of the arc. Additionally, from there, it's when the buyer is asking really specific questions and buying questions, and I've recognized that they've actually been talking about it internally, and there's a clear movement happening. That's part of the arc too, because I can't go and forecast a sale until I know all of those things have happened. But I would say those four things are probably the most consistent in terms of that process.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that value piece a little bit, because I think that's also something that people struggle with in both selling themselves to become salespeople and in just the general job search overall, right? Like the kind of cliche I always make is like Nike doesn't say buy our shoes so that our shareholders can make more money, right? It's a terrible sales tactic. And so like for us to say like buy this product so I can hit, you know, my benchmarks, or you know, hire me so that I can get mentorship and a paycheck. Obviously, like these are things that we think, right? Everyone needs money, everyone needs a job, everyone needs a paycheck, but we have to present ourselves as problem solvers, and not just using the word I solve problems, but like being specific about that and really connecting with the needs of the person that we're talking to. And so what are some of the things that have helped you showcase that value quickly, or maybe not even quickly, but like most effectively through your years in sales?
Yeah, so we could break it down in two parts of a sale and then trying to get hired for a role. So the value starts very high level. So from a buyer buying a software, they know, or they've recognized, or they've read that they need to implement X software because it does Y. And so they've kind of high level realized that's what they need to go out and buy. The value point is when they not only realize that exactly what they're going to be able to solve, but they start to have the light bulb moment of, this is the company that's going to be able to solve exactly what I'm trying to do. And they've clearly outlined the value that aligns exactly with what we're doing. So it becomes less of the high level, we need this tool, to we need X company to be the solution. And the same thing happens from the value that is produced and created within a candidate or someone looking to get a new role. The hiring manager goes out and creates a job description. They know that they need to fill this specific type of function and role. The value and realization of that hiring manager is when they decide that the person I'm talking to is the value and is the epitome of exactly what I'm looking for. And that person has demonstrated the value so that it aligns with their goals with the business. So there's definitely parallels between the two. But I think it's when it comes into that more like funnel version of this is the specific exactly what I need versus, that general initial thought.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important to keep in mind, because it really does kind of connect. It almost takes the pressure off in some ways, right? Like if it's about, if your whole goal is to be impressive or know everything or like have every answer, you're going to get too caught up in your head trying to like mitigate every situation. But if your goal is to be helpful and solve problems and like understand and ask questions, it really does shift things. And I think that that's one of the things that people don't realize about sales. They don't realize that learning this skill doesn't make you some weird, creepy Wolf of Wall Street, con artist. It makes you stronger. It makes you more confident. It makes you someone who can advocate for yourself and the things that you want to do. And people are really scared, especially if they've never done sales before. They're really scared to pick up that phone, to send that email, to make that call. And I almost wonder, and we can start digging into like the changes that have happened over the years, if the pandemic and the isolation and the lack of interpersonal contact has almost made people even more nervous about it. And one of the things that I've learned about sales is that, you know, I'm an introvert who's super anxious. So like when I started, even just trying to get people to take free movie tickets, I was like sweating on the phone talking to these people. And, but over time you build a thicker skin. And I think people don't always realize that like it does work. Like you will build that skin over time. And I'm kind of curious, what does the process, I think people think that salespeople are just confident from day one. And it's, from my experience, that's absolutely not the case. So like, what do you sort of see as like the growth pattern of salespeople from maybe lacking some of that confidence to becoming like top tier salespeople?
Yeah. So no one starts confident on the phone. So there's a kind of an evolution that happens. Like when I was at that boiler room calling call center, it's hard to admit this, but I created a persona of myself that was not me. And it gave me that fake it till you make it type confidence to make those calls to these, multi-decade executives that had been in business way years more than I had been in. I created tactics to get past assistants and gatekeepers. I put on a fake British accent to get past them, like literally like things like that, which are just like it just demonstrates the level of persona I was trying to create. And this is something that a lot of sellers do, especially early. But what happens, the most important part for that chasm and the change is to when you realize that people buy from people, and the best way you could look feel like a real person to somebody is demonstrating humility. Humility and being able to admit when you're wrong, whether you're in an interview or during a sale, actually is a bonding mechanism that can take place if done accurately and properly. You can't go around kind of admitting that you have no idea what's going on. But if there's a question that you don't know the answer to in a sale, there's nothing wrong with saying, I've just to be honest, that hasn't come up for me, and reassuring them that you're going to get them the right answer, or giving them a parallel of a solution that was something that you do know that you can reference and bring in. But being able to admit when you're wrong, and admit when you don't know something, for a lot of people, it's an ego check, but it actually can go a long way in terms of demonstrating and creating that bond and that trust. So really good sellers aren't hesitant to have that humility. And some of the best sellers I know were not the most confident people either. They knew their stuff, but they didn't always give off an air of like alpha. They were willing to come to an equal level with the buyer and be in it with the buyer. Like I'm not trying to teach you everything. Like we're learning together, or we're exploring together. And once you have that connection, I think that's like a next level of being a seller. But it could also apply to a candidate too in an interview.
I really like that, and especially that sort of like getting on their level, right? And one of the things that I'm always trying to help people think about is how much to share, right? How much to say, how much to put out there, how honest should you be? And I love that you brought up the British accent thing. That's so funny. It kind of reminds me of when I pretended to be Australian when I was working at the checkout at Target, just because I was so bored.
Just for fun. Yeah.
But I convinced
that was part of it too.
Yeah,
part of it was pass the time,
the monotony of it. But there's this weird thing that happens in the job search. And I think this is maybe something you can also speak to as a business owner, is this idea that like employees are sort of encouraged to be I would say too authentic, too transparent. And companies pretend to be transparent to some degree. And it creates this imbalance, right? Where the company isn't, in their job description, it's like, we're amazing. We have these huge missions and huge goals. Working here is going to change your life. Everything we do is so awesome. Look at our value statements. And the job seeker becomes very almost feeling unworthy of working for this company, reading through these statements, right? And so then the job seeker who's maybe early in their career or making a change goes in and they're like, I feel like an imposter. I don't feel like I know what I'm doing yet. So I'm just going to tell this company that I don't even know. I don't even deserve this job, right? And I'm always trying to help people understand that, like, what the company's not telling you is that the last person quit because they were burnt out, or we just had layoffs 3 months ago and laid off 30% of the business, and now we're having to rehire. Like, they're not telling you that stuff in the job description. Meanwhile, the job seekers coming in, they're like, well, I don't have any experience, so I don't know. I can't answer those questions. It's like, it's almost too much. And I'm always trying to get people to speak to the companies the same way the companies speak to you, and kind of realizing that so much of the conversation is initially sales and marketing until you can build the trust and rapport and get to something a little more real, right? And I'm kind of curious, like, as someone who's on the other side and seeing how businesses operate, what are some things that you've seen that might be helpful to calm people down, or maybe help them, like, change the way that they talk about themselves in order to, not live in that insecurity so much, because you can't really sell from a place of insecurity, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really good advice to give people and candidates, to put it in perspective for them, because it does feel that way for some people, especially if they're early in their career, where you assume every company has their everything together, or if they're like an established company, you assume that everything is streamlined and operations are where they should be, but it's almost rarely the case. I think also it's important from the hiring end to be really transparent about those things. Like, maybe it's because I've worked at a lot of hyper growth companies that were never really, let's be frank, I mean, they weren't organized in every area. Like, we always had issues, and I when I was interviewing people, I would let them know, because I also want them to know what they're walking into. I would give them all the benefits, but I'd also outline, our shortcomings. So when they do start the job, or if they take it, it doesn't feel like a bait and switch to them. They know exactly what they're getting into in the areas that we're still struggling with as a company. I think that it's really important that the hiring side is also very clear on that. But for the job seekers, I mean, they like going into with the mindset of knowing that, like, a lot of people learn on the job, and you probably have experience that you're not able to tie into what you're going to be doing, but it's probably relevant enough to get you to where you need to be. Early in my career, I would latch on to even just like jobs that I had that were not relevant to the industry that I was entering. So I would talk about how I was a bellman at a hotel, and how I learned from the business executives that were my customers, which we were a very business heavy hotel. I would have conversations with them. I would learn what they were going through. I would learn about their businesses. I would ask, like, really in-depth questions. And I also learned that whole idea of, like, building rapport with people quickly, because I was carrying their bags up to their room, and I had 5 minutes to make a good impression and get my tip. And so even if I was in my early career going for a sales job, I didn't hesitate to tie in my skills to things that were irrelevant. And as long as the story makes sense and ties in properly, you can definitely do that. So I think that's something too that people just overlook, is what they've already been doing and how it could tie in.
Yeah, I really like that. That storytelling piece is incredibly important. And maybe we'll swing back around to that. We interrupt today's episode to let you know about Career Therapy's Unstuck coaching program. If you're feeling paralyzed by job search procrastination and unsure of what to do next in your career, we're here to help. Each month as a member, you will get access to 2 one-on-one coaching calls, unlimited virtual chat with your coach via Slack, invitations to bi-weekly group coaching sessions, and lifetime access to our 8-part job search curriculum. Want to take your search to the next level? Head over to careertherapy.com and schedule a free 15-minute consultation to chat with me today and see if coaching is right for you. Now back to our show. But I want to shift a little bit into the changes that have been happening in the world. And so there's kind of 3 different areas that I was breaking this down into. The first one is technological shifts. The second one is pandemic style shifts. And the third one is generational shifts in communications. But let's start with the technological shifts. You're talking about the boiler room and like earning that computer time, which is just so fun to think about.
Good times.
But what are some of the like biggest technological shifts that you've been seeing, whether it's things that Apple are doing or that Chrome is doing, or just things that are impacting our ability to conduct sales the way that it's been done for the last 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest shifts that are coming, I would say within the next 24 months, up to half of email addresses are going to be encrypted and tracking pixels are going to be blocked by default. So open rates and clicks, a lot of the information that people get from email marketing is going to be gone. So for the software industry, there's almost 200,000 B2B software companies who rely on email marketing and ad targeting, intent, cookies. These changes they're going to create a larger emphasis on different parts of the business that exist today, but haven't necessarily received as much attention as they have in the past. And so those are things like leaning into their own first-party data, the information that they have on their own website versus trying to buy third-party data. And then fundamentally, the next wave of that was what my company solves for, which is partnerships. The technology changes are going to influence and enhance the world of partnerships greatly. When you remove access to third-party data and buyer signals become limited, people are naturally going to lean into partnerships and partner ecosystems and to figure out who they know and who they're connected to, because you're not going to be able to go out and make cold calls. It's getting much harder to do that, and pretty soon cold email is going to be impacted significantly. So those changes are big, and I don't think a lot of people realize they're coming. But Apple has already put a lot of it in place for them. If you use Apple Mail, you have the option now to have a spoof email address or kind of a made up encrypted multi-digit email address that you can use temporarily when you sign up for a newsletter, for example. And you could still receive the newsletter without giving out your personal email. And then you have the shift to the remote work now, where less people are in the office, less people don't have a landline, but they don't have a work phone. So getting a hold of people with a cold call is much harder than it's ever been. So there are definitely some of these changes coming very soon. Apple has already began, and Chrome was supposed to do it this year, and they actually just pushed it out until 2024. But within the next 2 years, we're going to see a lot of big changes.
And so for someone trying to break into sales now, what should they be doing? What should they be looking into, paying attention to, or studying in order to be able to be competitive in this new space?
Yeah, so all of that being said, things like intent and ad targeting and email marketing aren't just going to disappear overnight. They're going to evolve and change and shift in terms of the amount of data people can get. So it's not going away. It's changing, and a good seller is going to need to be aware of those changes because they're going to impact their day-to-day. They may not be able to get the level of volume in terms of prospecting and opportunities and appointments through email that they had 5 years ago. And so they need to learn how to evolve with the changes that are happening. So it really comes down to a seller developing new muscles that are keeping up with the changes. So instead of grinding on prospecting emails all day, they'll start to spend 2 or 3 hours of their day talking to their partners and talking to their allies and frenemies in the industry to get intel, to find out, who's looking to buy. Can you make that warm intro for me? Those things are going to become more valuable. And a good seller is going to know to use their time more toward those things.
Can you dig into what the partnership stuff would look like in practice and in the day-to-day? Because I think this is an incredibly important thing for job seekers as well, because a lot of, like 80% of jobs are found through knowing people, right? And so I'm not sure if it's totally analogous, but maybe break down like what you mean by partnerships and what that would look like in both the sales space and maybe even in the job hunt.
Yeah, I mean, partnerships right now. So Matt Hines, the president of Hines Marketing, recently said, look, the importance of referrals has increased in recent years and only accelerated during the pandemic. So people are gravitating more to who they know. And we saw this at Partner Portal right when the pandemic started. And there was no more events and conferences. People were at home, and our inbound inquiries doubled overnight because people realized that they needed to use their partners. And so the way it would work from a partnership standpoint is we're living in this remote world now, where I talk to my colleagues on Slack and we have Zoom calls, and I talk to my partners on Slack and companies they're kind of sibling companies. They're affiliated to us. Maybe they're not competitors, but they talk to the same buyer. We talk and communicate the same way that I do with my coworkers. We have shared Slack channels. We have stand-up meetings on Zoom. And it's almost indistinguishable between this operating cadence between my internal coworkers and our partners. And that's a big change with the pandemic, because the way that partners and coworkers are engaging is nearly identical. And so what you're seeing now is an increase in technology that supports that behavior. And some of the examples would be like what we do, where if I'm talking to a partner of mine and they want to give me an intro or a lead, they're submitting it through our system, through a partner portal. So both of us have visibility on what's happening with that deal, and we can work the deal together. So there's a term called co-selling, kind of similar to co-marketing, where we can co-sell and share notes and almost get to a point where we're sharing a CRM because of the sheer growth that's happening in that behavior. And there's other companies too that are popping up from in technology. One of them is Crossbeam. It's a account mapping is what they call it. And what that does is lets you plug in your CRMs into one system and almost literally share a CRM, to the point where I can see what companies they're talking to, who are their customers, and I can start to request warm intros. And there's the collaboration that starts to happen across companies. And so that there's a lot of activity happening on the technology side. In partnerships, there was about $250 million invested across dozens of companies in 2021. And we saw some of the largest investors like Andreessen, A16Z, could get into the space, which is new, to have that institutional capital in this space, but it demonstrates just the changes that are happening right now. And then on the candidate side, things like LinkedIn and the social aspect of being able to find out who you're connected to, who knows who can introduce me, who can get me into a job, become way more important. I've been on LinkedIn for a long time. I think I joined in 2007 or around there. And thankfully I built up a really strong network that I could tap into, but a lot of people haven't. And they decide they want to go into the job search and they don't have those connections that they can reach out to. And so it's important, even if you're comfortable in a job now, you start to work on your LinkedIn profile, who you're connected to, and start to build that network. Because at least in my industry, in tech and in software, very rarely do you put in a cold application and get an interview. Unfortunately, it can be very much who you know. And whether you're getting the intro from somebody that's a colleague through LinkedIn, or you're reaching out cold to the hiring manager, you're most likely going to be using that network to get in and get your foot in the door. So yeah, there's definitely parallels between the way that people are leveraging technology and networks in partnerships and on the candidate side of getting hired.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's it reminds me of, the importance that people put on like, going to college, not just, or going to get a master's, not just for the education, but for the network, right? And a lot of times people are, self-taught developers, and they didn't go through a boot camp, and they, it hurts their job prospects because they don't have that built-in support network, people to chat with, people to kind of collaborate with, and so on. And it really does sort of showcase, like, I like that you brought up that collaborative marketing piece, because I think that's more easy for people to understand and to sort of see out in the world. Like anyone who watched the Super Bowl, you see how like a commercial isn't just a commercial for one brand anymore. It's always like featuring 2 or 3 different brands. It's almost like how music has changed. It used to be one band singing one song, but now it's like 10 different artists on each song, in order to get that reach, in order to get that visibility. And I think the same thing is going, it's just kind of trickling down from these like high media places into our personal lives, where it's like, if the number of people that I'll talk to and they're like, oh, I want to be a marketer, I want to be a nurse, I want to be a lawyer. And then I'll ask them, do you know any nurses? Do you know any lawyers? Do you know any marketers? And they're like, no. And I'm like, then how do you even have how do you even have a basic understanding of what the reality of that job is, right? And so we get them to go meet people who do these things, and then they're like eyes light up, realizing this is absolutely what I want to do. Or maybe they kind of freak out because they're like, oh, I had this image in my head of what this was, and it's not even close to what I was expecting.
Oh, I mean, it's so easy today too. Like, it's not just LinkedIn. I'm in like 6 workspaces on Slack, and each of those other workspaces I'm in are primarily used for networking. It's different groups of my buyers, different groups of my peers, other founders and CEOs. Like there's Slack, there's Discord, there's Clubhouse. Like, you can be on any of these things and picking up tips and being able to at least like talk the talk, but also networking at the same time. I think it's like actually a lot easier today to gravitate and put yourself in that group and that network than it ever has been prior.
Yeah. I mean, I used to have to run home at like, take the train 2 hours back into the city in order to network with people at like 8 p.m. at a coffee shop. And they were sitting around just like bummed out that I was taking so long. Like, it's so much easier to just set up a 15-minute Zoom with someone, but it still scares people, especially if you haven't been primed with this sales background, or if you're more introverted, or if you're more anxious or anything like that. And so we kind of have to dip our toe in the water and just slowly learn these things. And I think remembering that this is not a gross thing to learn, it's actually a relational thing, it's a connecting thing, it's about getting to know people and their needs and their wants, and just trying to like sort of help in any way you can. And doing that, I think, is huge. And it reminds me of, even with this podcast, I remember a family member found out I was doing this podcast, and they're like, wait, you have other career coaches on your podcast? Aren't they your competitors? And I'm like, if you look at it strictly from I guess like a hardcore business, old school standpoint, but it's like people hire coaches based on personality. So they're going to go with whoever they want to go with based on the vibe, in a way. And so it's not really, it's cross promotion, which is, an old school term as well. But these things, they all sort of, I guess the adage you would want to say is like, the tide raises all the boats, right? And so if everyone's working together and everyone's kind of supporting each other, then everyone can succeed, right? And so let's go ahead.
Hopefully a lot of those barriers are removed, even for like for a lot of minorities that in tech that were unable to come in and get interviews and jobs and network. There were a lot of barriers, and the hope is, I hope that virtual capabilities, being able to hop on a Zoom and meet somebody, not have to go into the city 2 hours, like your example, to get a coffee, but the access, I would hope, it would increase for everyone to level the playing field. So even underserved communities can have the opportunity to get those jobs and move into industries that we haven't seen as much of a presence for as well.
Actually, to that point, I had a client recently in Saudi Arabia, and they were very scared to send like a networking email to someone and like do a cold email. And There was like, gender things at play. There's a lot of societal things at play, things that I don't even understand, right? 'Cause it's a totally different country. And, they went for it. And the first email they sent out, they got coffee with the person virtually. And then that person immediately invited them to help out on a project. And they've been working
That's
on a
great.
project, like literally the first email they sent worked. And normally when I'm talking to people, I'm like, have low expectations and a high amount of output. But sometimes like that first one can really hit. And there's so much there. And I think, as we kind of move into the last part of the conversation here, I want to just kind of, we've talked about how technology has shifted, how the pandemic has even shifted some things in the way that we interact. And I guess the goal or the hope is that as things open back up, we get a nice hybrid where it used to be really hard to get someone on Zoom, but now it's super easy. But then we can also be in person if we want to, and there might be a nice mix there. But when it comes to, this is always a fascinating conversation, when it comes to generational shifts, what are you sort of seeing in the way that people communicate differently over time, right? Like when we were coming up, phone was the thing, right? And then in our world, it's like email and Slack and messaging, right? And then, I think the younger generation is maybe growing up with even different technologies that, the TikToks and the video and things like that. They're like way more video savvy than our generation, or at least, the generation right before us. So what sort of generational shifts are you seeing? And, are there things that are kind of being phased out that people don't need to spend as much time on? Or are there things that like, maybe they're not being exposed to enough that they should try and go get some extra exposure to?
Yeah, the exposure part is big. If you have somebody who's been in a particular industry for a long time, even sales, even in a lot of folks that have been in sales for a couple decades, and maybe they've been working at a company that was also not as forward facing, maybe like an older technology or an older brand. The thing I've learned is that a lot of these individuals just haven't been exposed to the tech stacks that are being used across teams in newer companies. And so when they go interview at like a new hot tech company or something, a newer brand that's come in fruition, they are overwhelmed by the number of tools and systems that are required to operate day to day. This is very true in sales because sales has evolved so much. It used to just be email and calls, and now you've got your sellers that are leveraging their own marketing automation with Outreach or SalesLoft. You have people running their own direct mail campaigns with Sendoso and Postal. You have sellers that are leveraging partnerships through technology. There's just so many different tools that they have to use, not to mention Slack, which most people are pretty familiar with by now, but it's just one additional muscle that needs to be learned. And so, yeah, there's a level of exposure that it's tough to go and learn all of those systems without being in the role. But it's even harder to come in a new role and learn those on the job. So it's becomes a very tough position to be in as a different generation. That's probably the most obvious one for me. I think what people can do is familiarize themselves with those tools and systems and understand kind of how a modern seller leverages all of them together so they can at least have the framework of what needs to be done. But I do think that's a big challenge for generations to come in. With the newer generations, if I'm hiring sellers out of school or people that want to go into sales out of school, they more than likely have, even if after a few years out of school, they more than likely didn't have that boiler room experience that we talked about earlier. So how do I get them comfortable on the phone? How do I make them realize that you don't need to take it personally when people are hanging up on you? It's a different learning curve for them because they've grown up in an era that is very much text-based, phone, email. So yeah, there's behaviors on both ends that need to be learned, and they'll pick up the tech stack process much easier, but there's elements of the sale that they may not pick up on as easy.
Yeah, I think that there's sort of a fascinating, and maybe we say this for another conversation, but a fascinating shift in like even dating, you're getting pre-qualified through an app these days, right? Like everything is so systemized and organized and text-based. And I think that maybe the biggest opportunity for folks is like, how is video going to shape the future of sales? And maybe that's something for another conversation, but short form video, I've seen, a lot of people, instead of writing emails, they'll use those apps that allow them to do like a really quick, like 30-second video that gets sent via email to someone and things like that. But as we're looking at all these different shifts and we're kind of projecting into the future, I'd be kind of curious just to get an idea of like, if there was one thing someone could do to help build their confidence in how they talk about themselves. And maybe you can also touch on like the importance of, I guess, a personal brand. Like you talked about the persona that you built early on, but it was like sort of a fake it till you make it persona versus like this like hyper focus on authentic brands today, which maybe is going a little too far in the other direction, right? Like what is something that someone can do to put themselves out there, build their confidence, but maybe do it in a healthy way? What would you recommend?
Yeah. I mean, when people are trying to build their confidence for a role or for an interview, they take the time to go and do their research on the product, on the company, on the person they're interviewing with, and how they're going to talk about what they're going to talk about, all that stuff. So we all invest all this time into this level of confidence that we can project and to come into the meeting and feel really good about it. However, on the flip side, we're less likely to spend time on our understanding ourselves and most importantly, discovering the things that we don't know. What do we not know about ourselves? What do we not know about? What are the gaps that we have that we're unaware of? And I think there's an intentionality that goes with that in the process that requires you to sit down and say, here are the things I've been really good at. I definitely want to hit on these things. But what are the things, like, ask yourself, because there's always that annoying interview question about your top 3 weaknesses, but like, we should be asking ourselves, what are our weaknesses? And we should have awareness around them. Because if I'm going to be really confident in an interview, I'm going to be more confident if I know exactly either how I'm going to answer that tough question, or kind of like be able to validate and back up the areas that I know that I'm weak in. A hiring manager also will respect that and appreciate when somebody has that level of intuition and self-awareness, that they know exactly where their shortcomings are. But I do think that formulates into this whole idea of being more confident, is just to have that underlying understanding and take the time to spend understanding yourself.
Yeah. And these things are scary. So, that's why there's so much information out there that's helping people, explore those things and dig in, because without that understanding, we're just babbling. Right. And so it's good to dig in. So Eddie, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. This is such a deep dive and I loved it. Where can people find out more about you, and what are you working on these days?
Yeah, so partnerportal.io is a company that I'm running right now. We just raised our first round of funding. So if you know anyone in the B2B world that needs a better way to manage their partnerships, we're a good place to start. And then feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. That's probably my most used vehicle. I'm not on Twitter or any of those too often, but LinkedIn definitely is a good place to start.
I love it. Thanks for joining us today, man. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode today. I really appreciate your support of what we're building here at Career Therapy as we continue to try and explore the hidden side of modern work and tell some of the stories that maybe don't get enough light shed on them. If you enjoyed what you listened to today, I hope you will leave us a review on iTunes. Subscribe to this wherever you're listening or watching on YouTube, Spotify, etc. And share this with some friends who you know are going through similar experiences and looking to build their career and gain some insights along the way. Again, thank you so much for stopping by, and I wish you the best. I'll see you on the next episode.